When I was in graduate school, I was a bicycle commuter, which means I left my car parked at my house and I biked pretty much everywhere. I biked to the grocery store and I biked to class. I was living in Carrollton, which isn't hard to get around in with a car, but I liked the flexibility of not ever having to look for a parking spot, especially driving to campus or riding to campus. And I liked being able to pull right up to the door and lock my bike up and go inside. Sure, there were some downsides. It was difficult to get a bunch of groceries if I was on my bike, but I could always take my car if it was important to get a lot of stuff. Now, when I moved to Albany, Georgia, the infrastructure for biking around wasn't quite as strong. There weren't as many bike lanes, and I sensed that the other drivers weren't too fond of cyclists on the road. Now, to make matters worse, when I was talking to one of the runners I had met in town, they explained that a cyclist had just the previous year been hit by a car driving on a highway. So they were riding along the shoulder of a highway, got hit by a car by a drunk driver, and then dragged beneath the car for, I don't remember exactly, a quarter mile, a half a mile, and essentially left there. Now, this cyclist made a full recovery, but everyone was talking about it. And that, combined with my sense that it wasn't very safe in Albany to drive, to bike around, told me that I need to keep my bike at home and drive everywhere. And so for, I guess, the next 10 years, I did almost no cycling. Now, the strength of that story, it was a very vivid story. I could almost see like the skin being scraped from the cyclist's body because evidently it's not safe to go biking in Albany. Yet there are thousands, probably order of thousands of cyclists in town who ride regularly who don't get injured. And if I were to look at the statistics, I probably have a better chance of dying in my car than I do on a bike. It's just statistically improbable that I would be struck. Now, it's awful what happened to this one guy, but the strength of that one story, that one testimony, was enough to compel me, or at least convince me, not to ride my bike, or not to take it as seriously, or find an alternative. And that the vividness of like that image stuck with me. And so what I want to talk about in this video is what Stanovich outlines in chapter 4, which is, in my opinion, one of the simplest, most basic principles of scientific reasoning, yet it's also one of the hardest to accomplish. If you can accomplish this understanding, if you can achieve this way of looking at the world and evaluating evidence, then you will jump from the average interpretation of evidence, which is kind of how anyone in the grocery store is going to interpret facts when you give them to them. And you'll jump all the way to like the 98th or the 99th percentile, just doing this one thing. But it is exceedingly difficult to accomplish this shift in perspective. And what that shift in perspective asks for is for you to suspend your gut instinct or the persuasiveness of an alarming story. And so this is a story that has been designed to captivate your attention and to persuade you. You need to suspend that gut reaction and look at something using the principles of scientific reasoning. So this means going against your reflex response or your reflex interpretation. And most people can't do that. Most people are unwilling to do that because if they feel strongly about something, or they have this wave of emotion, they follow it. It's much easier to follow it because we can convince ourselves of a lot of things if the feeling is already there. And so in the story that I just shared, I was a little nervous about cycling in town, and I heard the story, well, this one guy, I don't want that to be me. Well, statistically, it's not going to be me. I would have to, I don't know, increase my hours of biking 1,000-fold, and even then we're still talking about equivalent likelihood of me getting struck by a semi while I'm driving than getting hit by a car and drug underneath. So what I'm asking for you to do, or what this chapter asks for you to do, is suspend the emotional response that stories, personalized stories, narratives, testimonies, case studies have for us. Suspend that emotional response and try to evaluate it as evidence that you're considering. And if it's evidence you're considering it as, you have the same principles we've talked about already. So, is this evidence valid? Is it reliable? Is it asking, or is it being used to test a falsifiable hypothesis? Does it rely on empirical data? And so on. So you take it into consideration as though it were scientific evidence. And in that respect, most stories, though compelling, don't tell us anything. So in this video, I'm going to define case study, define testimonial, and these are two different forms of storytelling in science. One is non-scientific, so that would be testimonials. The other is case study, and we need to understand what a case study is and how it fits into science, and it's not probably what you expect. And then I'll differentiate between the two. But before I get into that, I want to tell give another real example of how this case study and testimonial evidence plays out in higher education. So, and I'm guilty of this too. I have been guilty of it, and I need to remind myself, wait a minute, I need to evaluate evidence using scientific reasoning. Every semester we meet together as a college, so this is faculty and staff, and someone will present research that they've been doing, institutional research, to get a sense of where our students are at, what faculty are doing, what can be done to improve our university, and so on. And I've heard this a couple of times, and it often erupts in an argument when some people are employing scientific reasoning, some people are employing emotional reasoning, and there's almost always a stalemate. And we're talking about advanced degree holders, a lot of whom are scientists, some of whom have studied at a very high level in the arts and humanities, but even still, there's no reason to follow emotional feelings when there are more grounded, valid ways of looking at evidence. Here's something that I've heard said and argued. Students today don't care about learning. It's a pretty sweeping generalization. Of course, it's possible to find an example of a student who doesn't seem to care about learning or who makes no effort to learn. And that can be very frustrating to a college professor. And so imagine having a student in your classroom who isn't really putting forth any effort. And so all the other students are working diligently, they're working hard, they're trying to understand a new way of looking at things, and then one student just doesn't seem to care, and it's like the professor's focusing only on that one student. And then they generalize that frustration to everybody, because how could one student be causing all their frustration when the other 99% of students are working perfectly fine? Well, this professor focuses on the one student, and then they complain about it in the faculty lounge, and other professors say, yeah, I know, like, I've got this one student who never reads the readings before class, they miss exams, they show up late, and we can all cobble together stories, and these are anecdotes, these are testimonials, these are my own perspective, here's what I've seen. But when we get that kind of testimony, it can be compelling, especially if it's something that frustrates us. We want to feel like we're not alone. We connect to other people's stories, and pretty soon we have faculty with this sort of position. None of the students care about learning. Now, if we were to look at the evidence they collected, each one had one student out of 30, maybe. And so that's the extreme minority. It's hardly every student. But then you hear other faculty say the same thing, and you're connecting. All the faculty have experienced students who don't care about learning. Therefore, students don't care about learning. What can we do about that? I feel helpless. There's nothing to do. And as you can see, it's not very far before all the faculty kind of give up. Or maybe they were looking for an excuse to give up. They didn't want to work as hard. But as you can see, the emotional side of these testimonials kind of takes hold, and the scientific reasoning part, or the rational thinking part, gets thrown out the window, and everyone's just kind of commiserating and talking about what's awful. I've also heard faculty overgeneralize the use of marijuana among students. All of the students smoke, or yep, usually it's smoke. That not a whole lot of students like taking the edibles. But when I've polled, like I've actually collected this data, and a lot of students are uncomfortable talking about it. Several of them report using THC products, but I'd say the majority don't. And it's and so like I've heard a lot of faculty say that like pretty much everyone smokes, and it doesn't add up. Like when I collect the data, now of course the data collections that I have may not be very sound. Maybe students are lying about it, but still, I don't get the sense that the testimonial approach has been very effective. And for the most part, it distracts us from what really is. And I imagine you wouldn't appreciate it if one student in a class of 30, their behavior was generalized to you. That's not fair. And that's exactly what happens when you take a case study or a testimonial and expand it to everything. All right, so the book in chapter 4 gives a couple of really good examples of the problem of vividness with testimonials and case studies and how compelling those can be. So, the example that I really like is how dangerous it is to fly in airplanes. And I like this because I always ask students, how many of you are afraid to fly? And then hands down, and how many of you are afraid to drive? And I've never had the hands go up in proportion to the actual danger of these two forms of transportation. It's something like you are 1,000% more likely to die in a car than you are in a plane. And that's controlling for proportion of drivers and flyers. Um, but when a plane goes down anywhere in the country, we hear about it. Oh, a plane went down in Dallas and like 400 people died. I'm making that up, by the way. But we hear that and we think, I'm never flying. But we forget that thousands of drivers die on Georgia interstates every year. That's a lot more than 400 dying in one single crash. But the one plane crash is easy to imagine. 1,000 motor accidents don't really impact us the same way, but statistically, that tells us we're a lot more likely to die. I think the statistic they give in the book is you dropping someone off at the airport and you say, good luck, or fly safe, hope you make it in one piece. But the person who's driving back home is like 2 times or 20 times more likely to die on the drive home than the person is to die flying. And so statistically, we would trust flying is way safer than driving. But few people actually feel that way. And so we go with our gut feelings, and consequently, we're afraid to fly. Um, Another point of that was mentioned, a lot of flyers would pay an extra $50. That would be like an extra 10% to their ticket price for a safer flight, if it promised a safer flight. But even though driving is less safe than flying, most people don't buy cars with the sole purpose of providing safety. There are brands, there are makes that focus on safety. Like Volvo, for example, has a really high safety rating, but people don't flock to Volvo. They flock to cars that are fast, unsafe, or tall, unsafe. There are other like aesthetic reasons, and safety isn't the primary concern, even though driving is one of the least safe activities you can do. All right, I'm not going to talk about driving anymore. Those are just really good, I think, statistical examples of where testimony evidence often supersedes scientific reasoning. And if we employed scientific reasoning, we would be way safer, but we kind of allow our emotions to dictate what our understanding is. All right, so let's see. There are several examples in the book that I think are great. I think I've given enough. All right, what is a case study? A case study has a place in the scientific research methods. So I've conducted case studies, and I think I've conducted excellent case studies, but they're not to be confused with an experiment. An experiment is what we'll be talking about throughout this book, Stanovich's How to Think Straight About Psychology. A case study, in comparison, is one instance of, let's say, a psychological disorder, or maybe a social category. So let's say lower socioeconomic class, or even someone with gender dysmorphia. And so this one person provides a look or a glimpse or a view into a psychological disorder or a social category, something that helps us understand that category better by giving a a fleshed out example. So it's a real person that we can get to know and sort of understand the problem or the difference or life experiences through their lens. And ideally, this person represents an obscure category or a rare condition, one that we could never hope to understand experimentally because we could never get together enough people to have a representative sample. And so one of the case studies that I did was with um, a Division II NCAA football player who had suffered 7 concussions and started having these bizarre headaches and hallucinations and changes in mood and affect, and all of his relationships sort of fell apart. And as you can imagine, it spiraled out of control. And then it reached a point of losing everything. And then this athlete managed to turn it around. He gave up football and built a new life around something that wasn't athletics, his athletic identity, which was really important to him. It earned him this full ride scholarship and all sorts of attention. And then he realized that there was more to relationships than performance, and so on. So it was this whole story that we got to see about concussions, or like what's called post-concussion syndrome, this collection of symptoms that kind of fit together following lots of closed head injuries. Um, Now, does that mean that's what happens with concussions? No. It means this is what can happen. This is what it might look like. And by telling the story, it's it brings it much closer. This condition, this condition that's impossible to study experimentally because there's no signifier for it. It's just these collection of personal experiences, and we examine those personal experiences in depth. I had like a 2-hour interview with this guy, and I learned a lot, and I wanted to share it. Simply one person's experience going through it, and because it was so rich in detail, it allowed us to interpret existing statistics a little bit better. They didn't replace the statistics. So if this athlete recovered in the end, I wouldn't say, oh yeah, athletes recover from it. No, I'd say this one athlete recovered from it, and here's why I think that happened. And so here's how we can understand it based on this one case. So the findings from a case study can be beneficial to create new experiments that control variables that allow us to say things with reliability and validity and to make testable hypotheses. But a case study itself isn't testing a hypothesis. It's a way of understanding a condition, or again, like a social category, a little bit better, and giving um, flesh and blood and bones and all that stuff to it, kind of giving us a personifying it in a way. So case studies do have a place in scientific progress. And if I were to kind of situate it with all research, it would be at the very beginning of a new approach. And so the existing approach dictates how to collect data and analyze it. And right now in science, that's the experimental method. But if the experimental method is incapable of revealing, in this case, post-concussion syndrome, which there isn't any physiological identifier for it. We can't prove that it exists at all. It just happens to. People report it. So it's like this frontier that experimentation can't quite grasp. So that's where case studies fit in. And then that might shed a light on going in a different direction with new experiments. So again, it's at the beginning of a new form of research, or maybe picking up where existing research models can't explore anymore. So case studies can be beneficial, but they are not to be confused with an experiment, which allows us to make general claims about human experience and human factors in human behavior, thinking, and so on. Now, what is a testimonial? A testimonial is not scientific. It does not fit into the scientific canon at all. A testimonial is one person's experience. They're reporting on, yes, I've had that experience. And to be honest, a testimonial isn't even dependable. In the book, there were a bunch of examples. The Amazing Randy, he was this guy who debunked a bunch of superstitions and beliefs, and by kind of proving that they were false or unfounded. Um, but he demonstrated, and in the book it was explained, that a lot of times we can remember having an experience, but we actually misremember it. And we misremember it in ways that confirm what it is we're trying to prove. So even the testimonials that we hear, as scientists, we need to assume that they've been presented in such a way as to be persuasive. So in other words, when people share a story, they embellish some parts. So, for example, if I was telling a story about playing basketball and I was outplayed by my opponent, I might overemphasize the height difference. Like, oh yeah, he was like 7 inches taller than me. When in actuality, he was maybe only 2 inches taller than me, or we were the same height. So I just add something to it to make it look less embarrassing on my part. Or if I was racing someone, I might say like, oh yeah, I had this calf injury, and so when in fact like maybe it was just a little bit of tightness and it shouldn't have impacted my performance at all. Testimonials aren't really to be trusted, and even if they are honest reports, the study of memory in psychology has kind of shown that when people report memories, we're often inaccurate, and it's really easy to have those memories changed for one reason or another. So it's difficult to rely on testimonies to begin with. But let's say like someone does report something exactly as it happened, we need to remember that this is one isolated case, n equals one. And when we're trying to test a scientific claim, we need not only this one person's testimony, we need about 80 other testimonies in carefully controlled conditions. So the single testimony is uncontrolled. There is no promise that the one variable that they're reporting is the variable that they say that it is, and not some other variable they didn't recognize. But in an experiment, we can test one variable alone and try to control all the other ones. And so it's only in that highly careful and controlled setting that we can make a claim about something, say, um, students' consumption of THC products or students' likelihood of trying to learn. We would have to get a large enough sample and then control as many variables as possible to see, okay, what is actually happening? Let's make a claim that students don't want to learn. How could we test that? How could we prove that it's false? In other words, how could we disprove it? How could we reject that hypothesis? But with testimonials, it's not hard to construct a testimonial that supports a belief or supports a hypothesis. But as people thinking using scientific reasoning, we cannot trust a testimonial, and we can't trust a case study as providing evidence to support a hypothesis. It helps us understand a problem more, but it doesn't help us. It doesn't tell us what caused the problem. Case studies aren't capable of that, so we can't use case study evidence to prove cause and effect, for example. And we can't use testimonials for anything. So, as I said at the beginning, this this rule in scientific reasoning is very simple. Don't rely on testimonials as evidence. They are not evidence. Don't treat them as such. They might be compelling, and they might be told with a lot of emotional fervor, but don't let that convince you or persuade you. Suspend it, set it aside. Okay, how can we test whatever this testimonial is pointing at? How can we actually test this scientifically? Or if there's a case study, that helps us look at this problem in a new way. Yes, it does open up a door, but that door doesn't tell us where it leads to. Like, we need to conduct organize new studies that help us understand what's beyond that door. So case studies definitely have a place in science, but they are not the same kind of vehicle for knowledge as experiments and quasi-experiments. But we'll get into all that later. So how to apply this? When you hear something that's compelling, bracket the compelling part. So compelling is it moves you to think one way or another. Bracket that, set it aside, and try to think about it the same way you would think about something boring and mundane. You're collecting data, and the data needs to be collected in such a way that it's been careful, it's been in a controlled setting where you can only look at the influence of one variable and all the other ones have been controlled. That the setup has been to test an empirical hypothesis or empirically test a falsifiable hypothesis, um, that it follows systematic empiricism, all of those rules that we've talked about already. Those are the way we move forward. It's not very attractive, it's not sensational, but it's reliable, it's trustworthy, it's valid. Um, I suspect that most people who try to employ scientific reasoning will be tripped up by this. That's why I said if you can accomplish this way of suspending compelling storytelling, move it aside and look at something with, call it emotion-free rational thinking and scientific reasoning, then you will jump to like the 98th or 99th percentile in the ability to think this way. You'll see through, I would almost say, 100% of media, because media is built around the compelling story or the compelling narrative, and they're designed and written in a way to be compelling. But you'll see that most of it is garbage. It's baloney. It's just smoke. That the real scientific progress isn't fashionable. It's not exciting. It can be exciting when you're doing it because little steps are exciting, but from like a lay perspective, it's not sensational. So we'll practice doing it in class. There are many examples in the book that kind of help you hit this reset button on the way that we evaluate evidence. And that's what it comes down to. Is this actual scientific evidence, or is it fiction? Is it storytelling? Is it designed to impress?